So, Peter, there are two companies, Industrial Commercial Bank of China and the Bank of China, are two companies that I found under that Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Registry through the CRA. These are state-owned Chinese banks. Okay, the Chinese government own these banks. Yet we've also used Canadian tax dollars to provide wage subsidies to these two banks, which, by the way, I should point out, the Canadian banks, to the best of my knowledge, not one of the big five Canadian banks has tapped into the CEWS, but these two Chinese state-owned banks have. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first off, the banking sector has received unprecedented levels of support, and this is another thing that we identified right from the very beginning. So the sum total of liquidity supports given to Canada's big banks is 750 billion. Wait for it. That's billion with a B. $750 billion. That is absolutely without precedence in Canadian history. Even the Harper government, that was very want to provide supports to the banking industry, they provided 116 billion through the financial crisis a little over a decade ago. So $750 billion given to Canada's big banks. What that basically meant was that we socialized the risk through the CMHC, Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and through other government agencies. The Canadian people assumed the risk for the banks with the objective that would maintain banking profits. And as we've seen through thus far during the pandemic, there's over $42 billion in profits from Canada's big banks. Again, and this is similar to the wage subsidy, they weren't asked to guarantee anything. We saw credit unions drop often their rates to zero because people are struggling to get through the pandemic. The banks, in some cases, made symbolic drops, but basically have just reaped the benefits of what has been an unprecedented level of government support. So I just want to clarify that when it comes to Canada's big banks, unbelievable levels of support.
They've done very, very well under this pandemic. I will also mention to you, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but if you aren't, you should look into this. The Canada Emergency Business Account, what was originally a $40,000 interest-free loan that got bumped now to $60,000. One of the questions I'd asked from day one was, like, what are the banks and credit unions getting out of this, other than, they're administering the program, and of course the big six Canadian banks combined account for something like 80 to 90% of all the outstanding CEBA loans. And they're getting paid, from my intel, they're getting paid 40 basis points annually by the federal government to administer those loans. And that's never been published, but I've got that intel from some bankers. So I think it'd be interesting for you guys to maybe check that fact, because by my analysis, that equals, if they get it fully funded, if they lend out all the funds they were looking to do, generates about $266 million a year in fees to the banks paid for by Canadians.
Thank you for that. And this has been part of the problem, the complete lack of transparency. We have been trying to get a lot of these details. I'm on the finance committee, and you'd expect the finance committee to have that information available to it. It's been a struggle, and as you've probably seen with the We Charity debacle, even getting that information, Liberal MPs filibustered for well over 2 months to stop documentation going to the Finance Committee and going to opposition MPs. And so there are a whole bunch of loose ends. The one that you mentioned is very important, and we're going to follow up on that. And a whole bunch of other questions that haven't been answered either. And so what we have is unprecedented spending by the federal government, but there hasn't been the transparency that is so important. When we talk about a pandemic, and I know you'll want to talk a bit about the issue of the excess profits tax. In the Second World War, what we did is we had transparency with opposition MPs. There was an attempt to get through that crisis together, and information was shared. We haven't seen that same level of transparency by any means through this crisis, which is the greatest that we've had since the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I agree. Well, look, that is a good segue into that other topic of the excess profits tax. One of my criticisms, if you wouldn't mind hearing this from me, is that I think that from a social policy perspective, the NDP really get things right from a sort of a visionary perspective. But the problem I see is when you get drilling down into the details. I really struggle. I'd love to have Don Davies on because I want to talk to him about this universal dental plan because my wife's a dentist. I think it's a phenomenal idea. So let's talk about the excess wealth tax. One of the things I've not been able to figure out is what defines excess profit. I mean, if a company, let's say a large public company, on average made $50 million a year in profits for their shareholders, and then last year in 2020 they made $60 million. Is the excess profit the 10, or what are you guys defining as an excess profit?
Well, we're looking to history to be the guide. And in the Second World War, we had an excess profits tax. So what that basically did was the finance department defined the regular profits as the pre-war years, the 3 pre-war years, and the average profit through that period. And then the former Mackenzie King government, the Liberal government at the time, put in place an excess profits tax that was 75% beyond those pre-war profit levels. And that was eventually, in the height of the war, extended to 100%, including tax credits that took effect after the war ended. So what we've been speaking about is having this similar approach, but a more modest tax level rather than the 75%. We've been talking about twice the corporate tax rate on what would be the excess of profit or the pandemic profit above the pre-pandemic profit levels that big corporations actually had. Now, the one challenge, and I'm sure you're going to raise this anyhow, Andrew, so I'll get right into it, is the fact that we have a huge and porous tax system now. It's profoundly unfair. And as the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer has recognized, we lose over $25 billion, largely corporate profit, that goes offshore to overseas tax havens. And so it's not the same tight tax system that we had in the Second World War. And we have to make allowance for closing what is a pretty egregious tax leakage to overseas tax havens as well. That's why it actually takes both measures to really make sure that we have the resources to rebuild this country after the pandemic is over, and to make sure we have the wherewithal to get Canadians through the pandemic as well.
Okay, that's helpful. Well, I know I think we're getting close to the end of our time. Before you go, Peter, can I quickly ask you about the 1%, because this is all on the same topic, same theme here, the 1% wealth tax on individuals or families. And I talked to Laurel about it briefly when she came in to talk to me. And one of the things I've gotten clarification on since she came in was that I think the proposal, it was originally 2%. I think now the NDP is proposing 1%, and it's an annual tax. So can you kind of just sort of articulate on that one?
Yes, in the same way that Switzerland and Norway, they have lower thresholds and actually a higher percentage in some cases. Other countries during the pandemic have also levied a wealth tax. And so what we're talking about is 1%, as you point out, though we've had other folks talking about higher levels. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have been very clear. 1%, it's an annualized levy. And like countries like Switzerland and Norway, it's a way of addressing what is a growing inequality between very, very wealthy and the poor in our society. And it's important to note, Canada's billionaires have increased their wealth over the course of this pandemic by over $60 billion. So if we're going to have the ability to make the investments that count, you would point to pharmacare, you've mentioned dental care as well. These are the kinds of programs that have more than 80% support of Canadians, if you believe opinion polls. We need to actually get our fiscal house in order. And that means making sure that this very porous tax system that is developed is shifted to a much fairer tax system. That includes a wealth tax. So that includes cracking down on overseas tax havens, which both the current and former government did nothing about. And it actually includes ultimately raising a few percentage points the corporate tax rate, which is gone excessively low. And we need to reach a fair level that actually allows us to make these kinds of investments. So it's an overall comprehensive approach. It's something where certainly with the business community, I come out of social entrepreneurship, so I understand you need to be able to plan. And so making sure that we are properly indicating where the tax rate will go and how we will close these loopholes and put in place something like an excess profits tax or a wealth tax. These are all things that we really have to do. And other countries are doing it through the pandemic because they're experiencing the same kind of challenges that Canada is. The alternative is, as we saw in the fall economic update, and Chrystia Freeland has proposed, is a significant cut in overall government spending. The problem with that, as I'm sure you know from the Spanish flu, the actual level of economic recovery, the length of time it took for people who are middle income and low income to regain their level of financial security that they had previous to the Spanish flu was nearly a decade. So the federal government is going to need to be investing over the next few years, and to create the wherewithal to do that, we really need to put in place a fair tax system. Now, I apologize. I'm going to have to step out.
No,
I really
good.
appreciate your time today, and you've asked fantastic questions as always. So
I'd love to have a longer conversation on these topics. I think you've got some more material I'd love to get from you on it that I think is well spoken. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time today, and look forward, to talking with you again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Peter.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.